Ash lies in the cracks between the stones, thin and grey now, almost weightless after more than 3,000 years. The wind moves across the high Anatolian plateau with a dry, restless sound, passing over broken walls, collapsed gates, empty chambers, and the remains of a city that once believed itself protected by gods, kings, armies, and mountains. Here, at Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, the ground still seems to hold the memory of heat. Storehouses were burned. Administrative buildings were damaged. Tablets hardened in fire. Roof beams fell. Doorways blackened. A city that had once commanded lands from central Anatolia to northern Syria became, in the archaeological record, a place of silence. Yet the silence is deceptive. Hattusa did not belong to a small forgotten tribe. It was the heart of one of the greatest powers of the Late Bronze Age, an empire that challenged Egypt, negotiated with pharaohs, fought over Syria, controlled mountain roads and river valleys, and ruled through a complicated machinery of kings, treaties, tribute, oaths, vassals, scribes, gods, and armies. Its rulers wrote in cuneiform on clay. Its diplomats corresponded with the other great courts of the age. Its soldiers faced Egypt at Kadesh in one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. Its royal archives preserved thousands of tablets, not because the Hittites expected to vanish, but because they expected the world they knew to continue. Then, around the beginning of the 12th century BC, that world breaks. The phrase often used is collapse, but collapse can make the event sound too clean, too simple, too much like a wall falling in one direction. What happens to the Hittite Empire is stranger than that. Its capital is destroyed or abandoned, its central authority disappears, its old imperial structure no longer functions, its great king, once treated as one of the major rulers of the known world, vanishes from the diplomatic stage. The archive stops speaking. The roads that carried orders from the palace no longer answer. The empire that had stood for centuries seems, from a distance, to have collapsed almost overnight. But no empire truly falls in a single night. Even when flames rise quickly, the conditions that make them possible gather slowly. Hunger works before fire. Fear travels before armies. Bad harvests weaken loyalty before walls are breached. Rival princes can do as much damage as foreign enemies. Trade networks can fail quietly, one missing shipment at a time, until a palace discovers that bronze, grain, horses, wood, and obedience are not guaranteed by royal command. What looks sudden in the ruins may have been prepared by years of drought, political strain, border violence, economic exhaustion, and a wider crisis spreading through the entire eastern Mediterranean. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the fall of the Hittites is not just the story of one burned city. It is one of the great unsolved dramas of the ancient world, a disappearance at the centre of a much larger disaster, where palace kingdoms across the Bronze Age world staggered, fractured, or died. To stand at Hattusa is to understand why the Hittites once felt secure. The city does not sit in a soft, easy landscape. It rises among ridges and rocky outcrops in what is now central Turkey, where winters can be severe, summers dry, and distance is punishing. The terrain itself seems defensive. The capital was enclosed by massive walls that bent and climbed with the land, guarded by monumental gates decorated with lions, sphinxes, and warriors. There were temples, royal compounds, storerooms, and archives. Hattusa was not merely a residence. It was a statement in stone the empire had taken a harsh landscape and turned it into an imperial mind. And yet, by the time archaeologists began uncovering its remains, the empire had long been so forgotten that its rediscovery changed the map of ancient history. The Hittites had survived in scattered references, in Egyptian records, in biblical memory, in hints and fragments. But the scale of their power was not fully understood until excavations and the decipherment of their language revealed a civilization that had once stood beside Egypt and Babylon. One of the more surprising details is that the Hittite language, preserved in cuneiform script, turned out to be the oldest known Indo-European language yet discovered. In other words, behind the ruins of this Anatolian capital was not only a lost empire, but a lost branch of linguistic history, a voice from deep antiquity that scholars had not expected to hear so clearly. The city's destruction layer, however, does not speak with one voice. Archaeology rarely does. There is burning, yes, and abandonment, and evidence that the imperial centre ceased to operate. But the evidence remains incomplete. Scholars still debate whether Hattusa was stormed by enemies, evacuated before destruction, weakened by famine, consumed by internal conflict, or finished by some combination of all these forces. Some areas may have been emptied before the final fires. Some valuables may have been removed. The fall does not look exactly like a simple sack in which a thriving capital is suddenly overwhelmed by invaders. It looks more like the last visible moment of a system that has already begun to fail. That distinction matters. If a city is burned while still fully alive, the story is one of attack. If a city is burned after power has drained away from it, the story becomes darker and more complicated. Hattusa may not have been merely conquered. It may have been abandoned by the very system that had created it. The palace, the temples, the scribes, the garrisons, the supply lines, the royal cult, the officials who measured grain and issued orders. All depended on the continued belief that the centre could hold. Once that belief weakened, even monumental walls became less meaningful. Stone can protect people from enemies. It cannot protect an empire from running out of trust. The Hittite collapse also comes at a time when the wider world is shaking. The Late Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, it was a web. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources, grain from Egypt and Syria, luxury goods from Mesopotamia, horses from Anatolia, timber from mountain regions, silver, textiles, weapons, brides, envoys, craftsmen, and letters moved across land and sea. Great kings called one another brothers, even while plotting against each other. Smaller rulers balanced loyalty and rebellion. A disruption in one region could echo across another. No single explanation fully accounts for this vast unravelling, but the Hittite Empire stands near the centre of it, both victim and participant. The old image of collapse often imagines barbarian hordes sweeping in and destroying everything. There were indeed movements of people, raids, wars, and displaced groups. Egyptian inscriptions speak of enemies from the sea. Cities along the eastern Mediterranean show destruction around this period, but the popular idea of one mysterious invading force ending the Bronze Age is too neat. It turns a human catastrophe into a simple invasion story. What survives in the record suggests something more tangled: climate stress, food shortage, migration, rebellion, military pressure, and the failure of palace economies that had grown too complex to survive repeated shocks. For the Hittites, the pressure may have been especially severe because their empire was both powerful and difficult to hold together. Anatolia is not an easy land to govern from one capital. Its mountains, valleys, rival regions, and frontier zones could shelter resistance. The empire stretched towards Syria, where it competed with Egypt and later Assyria for influence. It relied on vassal rulers whose loyalty had to be renewed through treaties and oaths. It depended on military force, but also on ritual, diplomacy, marriage, and the constant performance of royal authority. The king was not simply a commander. He was a sacred figure responsible for maintaining order between humans and gods. If famine came, if enemies advanced, if plague spread, if the weather failed, the crisis could become political, religious, and cosmic all at once. This is why the burned remains of Hattusa feel so haunting. They are not just evidence of destruction, they are evidence of interruption. Clay tablets preserve laws, rituals, myths, treaties, inventories, prayers, and diplomatic messages. They show a civilization intensely concerned with order. The Hittites recorded how ceremonies should be performed, how gods should be honoured, how disputes should be settled, how vassals should obey, how kings should remember obligations made before divine witnesses. Their world was built on the idea that words, properly written and ritually enforced, could bind reality together. Then the writing stops. Somewhere between the last orders and the final abandonment, the machinery fails. Perhaps grain shipments do not arrive. Perhaps frontier commanders cannot hold their posts. Perhaps rival claimants weaken the throne. Perhaps drought turns fields unreliable and herds thin. Perhaps refugees move across borders, bringing both desperation and disruption. Perhaps old enemies see weakness and strike. Perhaps all of this happens close enough together that the empire has no time to recover between blows. The mystery is not whether the Hittites were vulnerable. All empires are. The mystery is how so many vulnerabilities converged until a capital built to project permanence became a ruin. And still, the fall was not total disappearance. That is another twist in the story. The imperial Hittite state vanished, but people remained. Traditions survived. In northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, smaller kingdoms carried forward elements of Hittite culture, art, religion, and political identity for centuries. The empire died, but its fragments kept speaking in new forms. That means the word collapse must be handled carefully. It was the collapse of a central imperial system, not the instant extinction of a people. Yet from the high ruins of Hattusa, the drama remains sharp. A capital burns, a great king disappears from history, a palace archive falls silent. An empire that once terrified rivals and negotiated as an equal with Egypt leaves behind broken walls on a lonely plateau. The end looks sudden because the record narrows to a final image fire, abandonment and silence. But beneath that image lies a longer story, one that begins not with destruction, but with the rise of a people who learn to turn storm, stone, iron, and diplomacy into power. Long before Hattusa becomes a ruin, it rises as an answer to a difficult land. The Hittite story begins not in the soft floodplains of Egypt or the deep alluvial cities of Mesopotamia, but in the rugged heart of Anatolia, where the earth itself seems to resist easy rule. The plateau is high, broken by mountains, cut by valleys, exposed to harsh winters and dry summers, and rich in routes that matter precisely because they are difficult. Whoever controls these roads controls movement between worlds: the Aegean to the west, Syria and Mesopotamia to the southeast, the Black Sea lands to the north, and the inner Anatolian regions where local powers rise and fall among fortified settlements. This is not a landscape that gives empire freely. It has to be argued with, fortified, taxed, crossed, and understood. Before the Hittites dominate this world, Anatolia is already old with trade and conflict. Assyrian merchants from northern Mesopotamia have established trading colonies in central Anatolia during the early 2nd millennium BC, leaving behind thousands of clay tablets at sites such as Kanesh. These records speak of caravans, silver, textiles, tin, debts, contracts, family disputes, and business networks that stretch across mountains and political boundaries. It is a surprisingly intimate archive. Merchants complain, negotiate, marry, lend, borrow, and worry over delayed shipments. The later Hittite Empire does not grow out of empty land. It grows in a region already tied to international exchange, where local rulers understand wealth, writing, metal, and the strategic value of controlling roads. The people later called Hittites emerged from this mixed Anatolian world. Their own name for their land is associated with Hatti, an older cultural and political term already present before their rise. Their language, known today as Hittite, belongs to the Indo-European family, yet their culture is never simply one thing. They absorb and preserve older Hattian traditions, borrow from Mesopotamian scribal culture, interact with Hurrian religious ideas, and rule over populations with different languages and customs. This mixture is one of the first keys to their success. The Hittite state is not built by purity, it is built by adaptation. What survives in the record suggests a ruling culture unusually willing to collect gods, rituals, legal formulas, diplomatic habits, and administrative practices from the peoples it governs or encounters. The early Hittite kings appear in history with the energy of mountain warlords learning to think like imperial rulers. Figures such as Hattusili I and Mursili I push outward from central Anatolia, fighting rivals, subduing cities, and extending influence far beyond what the terrain seems to encourage. Mursili I's campaigns reach astonishing distances, including a famous strike against Babylon in the 16th century BC, though the exact political consequences remain debated. The event is startling because it shows how far Hittite ambition could travel. From an Anatolian power base, a king leads forces deep into Mesopotamian history and touches one of the great names of the ancient world. Yet such reach is also dangerous. A kingdom that expands too quickly can outrun the institutions needed to hold itself together. The early Hittite state suffers from exactly that problem. Royal assassinations, succession disputes, and elite violence appear again and again in the background of its rise. The throne is powerful, but it is not always secure. The Hittite court can be a dangerous place, where brothers, sons, in-laws, generals, and palace factions become threats as serious as foreign enemies. One lesser-known but revealing feature of Hittite political life is the importance of formal attempts to regulate royal succession and restrain palace bloodshed. The so-called Edict of Telepinu, from an early phase of Hittite history, looks back on earlier disorders and tries to impose rules on who may inherit the throne. Its very existence suggests that violence within the royal family was not an occasional accident, but a recurring danger that rulers recognise as a threat to the state itself. This is one reason the later Hittite Empire becomes so invested in oaths. Oaths are not ceremonial decorations, they are political technology. In a world where loyalty can fracture along kinship lines, regional identities, military commands, and personal ambition, a sworn oath before the gods is meant to bind the unstable human world to a divine order. Vassal rulers swear loyalty, officials swear obedience, treaties call down curses on those who break their word. The Hittites understand, perhaps better than many, that empire is not only land and soldiers, empire is agreement, fear, memory, obligation, and the shared belief that breaking faith carries consequences beyond ordinary politics. Hattusa becomes the centre from which this system is projected. Its location is not obviously convenient in the way a river capital might be. It is inland, elevated, and severe, but it is defensible, symbolically powerful, and connected to the Anatolian heartland. The city itself grows into a fortified sacred and administrative centre, with temples that remind visitors the empire is under divine watch, and gates that turn approach into theatre. The famous Lion Gate, the Sphinx Gate, and the King's Gate do more than protect entrances. They announce power in carved stone. Anyone entering the city passes through images of strength, guardianship, and royal presence. In a world where most people never see the king directly, architecture helps make the empire visible. The Hittites also build power through an unusual balance of violence and negotiation. They are formidable soldiers, using chariots, infantry, fortified positions, and campaigns across challenging terrain. But their empire cannot function through force alone. Too many regions are distant. Too many vassals have their own local interests. Too many rival powers compete along the edges. So the Hittites become masters of treaty politics. They bind subordinate rulers through written agreements. Marriages, hostages, gifts, and threats. The tablets preserve a world in which diplomacy is precise, legalistic, and deeply religious. A treaty is not merely a political document, it is a sacred trap for disloyalty. By the height of their power, the Hittites stand among the great kings of the Late Bronze Age. Their expansion into Syria brings them into direct competition with Egypt, especially over cities and territories that command trade routes and prestige. This rivalry culminates in the Battle of Kadesh in the 13th century BC, when Hittite forces under Muwatalli II confront the armies of Rameses II. Egyptian monuments present the battle in heroic terms, as royal monuments tend to do. But the broader political result is less simple. The Hittites do not vanish from Syria. Egypt does not secure total dominance. Eventually, the two powers make one of the most famous peace treaties of the ancient world. The fact that such a treaty is possible reveals the stature of the Hittite king. Egypt does not make that kind of agreement with a minor power. This is the Hittite Empire at its most impressive: stern, diplomatic, militarized, multilingual, and deeply ritualized. It can challenge Egypt, manage vassal states, preserve archives, and draw strength from Anatolia's hard geography. Yet the qualities that make it powerful also plant weaknesses. Its capital is far from some of its richest imperial frontiers. Its authority depends on constant communication. Its vassals must remain convinced that the centre is strong. Its royal family must avoid destructive rivalry. Its grain and tribute must keep moving. Its gods must be honoured properly. Its enemies must be watched on several fronts at once. The empire is not a solid block of stone. It is more like one of its own treaty tablets, carefully written, solemnly witnessed, durable when protected, but breakable under enough pressure. And for several generations, the system works. Roads carry messengers, scribes impress signs into clay, kings campaign and return, temples receive offerings, vassals renew their loyalty, Syrian cities look north toward Hattusa, as well as south toward Egypt. The imperial machine, though never effortless, continues to move. But the wider Bronze Age world around it is becoming more connected, more competitive, and more dependent on fragile flows of goods and trust. The Hittites have risen by mastering a harsh landscape. The next challenge will be harder surviving a world in which every kingdom's strength increasingly depends on every other kingdom's stability. By the time the Hittite Empire reaches the height of its strength, it no longer belongs only to Anatolia. It belongs to a wider world of ships, caravans, envoys, treaties, rival courts, bronze weapons, royal marriages, and dangerous expectations. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean is not a map of isolated kingdoms staring across empty distances. It is a living system, bright and brittle, where a decision made in one palace can matter hundreds of miles away, and where a failed harvest in one region can become a diplomatic emergency in another. Hattusa may stand among the rocks and winds of central Anatolia, but its power stretches into a network that links Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, Cyprus, Mycenaean Greece, Canaan, northern Syria, and the island and coastal worlds between them. This is one of the most important truths behind the later collapse. The Hittites do not fall in a simple ancient wilderness. They fall inside an international age. Great kings know one another by title, reputation, marriage, and messenger. They exchange gifts that are never merely gifts: gold, lapis lazuli, fine textiles, horses, chariots, ivory as carved vessels, and precious metals move between courts as signs of equality or submission. A king who sends too little may insult another ruler. A king who asks too urgently may reveal weakness. Diplomacy is wrapped in ceremony. But beneath the ceremony is calculation. Every greeting, every bride, every shipment of treasure, every complaint about delayed messengers belongs to the balance of power. The evidence for this world survives most vividly in clay letters from royal archives, especially those found in Egypt at Amarna, where pharaohs corresponded with rulers across the Near East. The Hittites appear within this diplomatic universe, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as threats, sometimes as one of the great powers whose movements cannot be ignored. What survives in the record suggests a world almost modern in its interdependence, though built on very ancient foundations. Kings call one another brothers, but brotherhood does not mean affection, it means rank. To be called brother is to be treated as an equal among the highest rulers. To be denied that status is to be reminded of one's place. For smaller kingdoms, this world is more dangerous. Cities in Syria and Canaan often live between empires. A local ruler may send letters begging for help, protesting loyalty, accusing rivals, or pleading that enemies are closing in. The great powers may see these places as strategic squares in a diplomatic game, but for the people inside them, imperial rivalry means garrisons, tribute, shifting allegiance, and the constant risk of punishment if the wrong side wins. The Hittites understand this game well. Their influence in northern Syria depends not only on conquest, but on the careful management of vassals who must be loyal enough to serve, yet strong enough to be useful. At the centre of this international system is bronze. The age itself takes its name from an alloy that requires connection. Copper is relatively available in several regions, with Cyprus becoming especially important, but tin is rarer and often has to travel long distances through trade routes that remain partly uncertain. Without tin, copper cannot become the hard bronze needed for weapons, tools, armour, and prestige objects on the scale palace societies demand. This means that the military and economic strength of great kingdoms depends on supply chains reaching beyond their direct control. A sword in a Hittite warrior's hand may represent mines, merchants, ports, caravans, treaties, and guarded roads. It's a weapon, but it is also a diagram of interdependence. The same is true of chariot warfare. Chariots require skilled craftsmen, trained horses, wood, leather, metal fittings, specialised maintenance, and elite warriors trained over time. They are not simple battlefield machines that any village can produce at will. They belong to palace economies capable of organising labour and resources across wide regions. The Hittites become famous for their chariot forces. An ancient battle account suggests their vehicles may have carried larger crews than some Egyptian chariots, though scholars still debate the tactical details. What matters is that chariots reveal the complexity of late Bronze Age power. A kingdom that fields them is not merely brave, it is organised. Yet organisation can become vulnerability. A small farming community may suffer terribly from drought or war. but it can sometimes survive by shrinking its expectations. A palace system cannot easily do that. It must feed dependents, reward elites, maintain temples, pay soldiers, impress allies, intimidate enemies, and continue the rituals of abundance that prove the king is favoured by the gods. If copper shipments slow, if tin becomes scarce, if grain stores fall, if horses die, if vassals rebel, the crisis spreads through institutions that are expensive to maintain. The very sophistication that makes the late Bronze Age dazzling also makes it fragile. Egypt, with the Nile's dependable rhythm, appears at first glance more secure than most. Its agricultural base is unusually strong, and its pharaohs command enormous symbolic authority. But even Egypt is tied to the world beyond its river. It needs timber, metals, luxury goods, diplomatic stability, and influence in the Levant. Babylonia and Assyria have their own strengths and pressures, each watching the balance of power in Mesopotamia and beyond, Mycenaean Greece. Organised around palace centres such as Mycenae, Pylos, and Thebes, participates in exchange across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus, rich in copper, becomes a crucial node. Coastal cities serve as gateways through which goods, people, rumours, and dangers move. Northern Syria is especially important for the Hittites because it is both frontier and prize. Cities such as Carchemish and Ugarit connect inland routes with maritime commerce. Ugarit, in particular, is a remarkable place, a cosmopolitan port kingdom where cuneiform tablets preserve multiple languages, trade connections, legal records, and letters from a world on the edge of catastrophe. It is one of those places where the Bronze Age network can be seen almost breathing. Goods arrive by sea, messages come from kings, merchants negotiate, palace officials track obligations, and near the end, the same archives begin to show fear. The evidence remains incomplete, but the anxiety in some late records is difficult to miss. The Hittite Empire's involvement in this network brings wealth and prestige, but also exposure. A crisis in Syria can drain Anatolian resources, a rebellion among vassals can threaten trade corridors, Assyrian expansion can pressure eastern borders, Egyptian rivalry can force costly campaigns, Aegean instability can disturb maritime routes. If Cyprus is disrupted, copper supplies may suffer. If drought strikes Anatolia and northern Syria at the same time, food shortages become harder to solve locally. No single thread breaks the whole fabric at once, but many weakened threads can make the fabric tear suddenly. This is why the idea of an empire collapsing overnight must be handled with care. The final, visible destruction may be sudden, but the world that produces it is already full of hidden strain. Late Bronze Age kingdoms are like great lamps burning on oil brought from many places. As long as the fuel arrives, the light looks steady. When roots fail, the flame may flicker only briefly before going out. To people inside the palace, the change may feel shocking. To archaeologists looking backward, the ash layer can look like an abrupt end, but beneath the ash lies a system that has been asking too much of distance, weather, loyalty, and luck. For now, however, the great kings still write, ships still sail, caravans still cross dry lands, Hittite envoys still move between courts, Egyptian scribes still shape royal victories into stone, Syrian rulers still calculate which empire is stronger, bronze still shines in the hands of warriors and craftsmen. The world before collapse is not a dark age waiting to happen. It is confident, skilled, and interconnected. That is what makes its failure so unsettling. It is not the fall of a primitive world unable to organise itself. It is the failure of a world that had organised itself brilliantly, perhaps too brilliantly, until its own connections became channels through which disaster could travel. The strength of the Hittite Empire rests not only on walls, armies, and conquered roads, but on a particular idea of kingship. The Hittite king is not merely the man who commands soldiers. He is the centre of a living arrangement between land, gods, ancestors, vassals, officials, and foreign powers. His body belongs to politics, but his duties reach into the sacred. He must fight when needed, judge disputes, maintain alliances, perform rituals. Honour the gods of Hatti and the gods of conquered peoples, and keep the machinery of obligation moving. In this world, a weak king is not just a political inconvenience, he is a danger to the order of reality. That helps explain why Hittite royal life is so heavily wrapped in ceremony. The palace is not simply a residence where decisions are made. It is a ritual engine. Festivals have to be performed. Offerings must be made in the right order. Old cults must be maintained. The gods must not be neglected, because divine anger could show itself through plague, drought, military defeat, or disorder in the royal house. Hittite religious texts are full of careful procedures, as if the universe itself depends on correct performance. The surprising detail is how many gods the Hittites are willing to recognise. Their land is sometimes called the land of 1,000 gods, not because anyone has counted exactly 1,000, but because Hittite religion absorbs deities from Hattian, Hurrian, Luwian, Mesopotamian, and local traditions. Conquest does not erase divine worlds, it collects them. This habit of collecting gods is also a political strategy. When the Hittites rule a region, they do not always try to flatten its identity into one imperial mould. They can incorporate local cults, respect regional traditions, and bring foreign deities into the orbit of Hattusa. That sounds tolerant in a modern sense, but it is also practical. To rule a mixed empire, a king must persuade many communities that their gods have a place within imperial order, a temple, a festival. or a divine name preserved in a treaty can become a quiet form of control. The empire does not merely take land, it tries to take the sacred geography of that land and bind it to the throne. The same logic appears in Hittite diplomacy. Their treaties are among the most revealing documents of the Bronze Age. They are precise, stern, and deeply religious. A vassal treaty usually reminds the subordinate ruler of past favours, defines obligations, demands loyalty, forbids alliance with enemies, regulates succession or extradition, and ends with divine witnesses and curses. These curses can be severe, because the treaty is meant to frighten not only the political mind, but the soul. To break faith with the Hittite king is to break faith before the gods. It is a legal act, a moral failure, and a cosmic offence at once. The famous peace agreement between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II shows this system at its grandest level. After decades of rivalry over Syria, the two powers recognise that endless conflict is costly and uncertain. The treaty does not create sentimental friendship. It creates a formal structure for peace, mutual assistance, extradition, and recognition. Both sides present the agreement in their own political language, and both use it to support royal legitimacy. For the Hittites, it is especially important because Hattusili III had taken the throne after a contested struggle, displacing his nephew Urhi-Teshub. International recognition from Egypt helped strengthen his position. Diplomacy, in this case, is not only foreign policy, it is domestic survival. This reveals a recurring Hittite problem: the empire can project enormous power outward, while remaining vulnerable inside the royal family. Kings may win battles and still fear rivals at court. A prince sent to govern a region may become a future claimant. A royal marriage may secure an alliance but create new factions. The throne is sacred, yet it is also contested by human ambition. Scholars still debate the details of several succession crises, partly because the records are written from the viewpoint of those who survived or won, but the pattern is clear enough. Hittite kingship is magnificent, and it is dangerous. Military power gives that kingship its sharp edge. Hittite armies are capable of operating across difficult terrain and at impressive distances. They use infantry, chariots, siege methods, and networks of vassal support. Campaigning is not just the act of sending soldiers into battle. It requires roads, food, animals, metal, craftsmen, intelligence, and the loyalty of local rulers who provide troops or supplies. In Syria, where Hittite influence reaches some of its most valuable territories, war and diplomacy are inseparable. A rebellious vassal might be punished by force, but afterward a treaty must restore the relationship. A conquered ruler might be replaced, but the new ruler must be bound by oath. The sword opens the door, the tablet tries to keep it closed. The Hittite chariot has become one of the symbols of their military strength. Ancient accounts of Kadesh suggest Hittite chariots were deployed in large numbers, and later reconstructions often imagine them as heavier vehicles carrying 3 men, driver, shield-bearer, and fighter. The exact picture is debated, and not every Hittite chariot in every period would have looked or functioned the same way. Still, the emphasis on chariot warfare points to elite organisation. Horses must be trained. Vehicles must be built and repaired, crews must practice, metal fittings, leatherwork, wheels, and harnesses must be maintained. A chariot force is not only a weapon, it is an expensive promise that the palace can gather specialised resources and turn them into battlefield shock. Then there is iron, the metal that later ages would associate so strongly with Anatolia and the end of the Bronze Age. The Hittites are sometimes popularly imagined as possessing a secret iron technology that gave them overwhelming superiority. That image is too simple. Iron objects existed before the Iron Age, and early iron was often rare, difficult to produce consistently, and sometimes valued as a prestige material rather than a mass military advantage. The Hittites did know and use iron, and Anatolia was important in the long development of ironworking. But there is no good reason to imagine Hittite armies sweeping the world with iron weapons, while everyone else remained helpless with bronze. The evidence remains incomplete, and the transition from bronze to iron is gradual, uneven, and complex. Still, iron mattered symbolically. A rare iron blade or object could carry prestige precisely because it was difficult. In a palace world obsessed with gifts, hierarchy, and display, rare materials have political meaning. A king who controls unusual metals appears closer to the hidden powers of the earth. Bronze may arm armies, but rare iron can impress courts. This distinction matters because the Hittite Empire is not only a military state, it is a theatre of authority, where materials, rituals, treaties, and monuments all tell the same story: the king commands things ordinary people cannot command. But every theatre requires constant performance. The gods must receive offerings, the army must receive supplies, the vassals must receive reminders, the scribes must receive orders. Foreign kings must receive gifts impressive enough to preserve equality. The royal family must receive enough honour to prevent rebellion, but not enough freedom to threaten the throne. The entire empire depends on repeated acts of maintenance. Nothing about Hittite greatness is automatic. That is the hidden fragility inside the brilliance. The empire's power is real, but it must be renewed again and again across long distances and uncertain seasons. A treaty does not enforce itself if the king looks weak. A chariot army cannot move if grain, horses, and craftsmen fail. A sacred kingship cannot calm fear if drought or plague makes the gods seem angry. Iron secrets, royal oaths, and carved gates all project permanence, yet they also reveal how much effort permanence requires. The Hittites have built one of the most sophisticated states of the Bronze Age, but sophistication is not the opposite of vulnerability. Sometimes it is the form vulnerability takes before anyone recognizes it. Beneath the treaties, the carved gates, the royal seals, and the shining language of great kings, the Hittite Empire rests on something less impressive and more unforgiving grain. A palace may speak in the voice of gods, but it survives on harvests. Armies march only after fields have produced enough surplus to feed soldiers, horses, craftsmen, priests, messengers, palace workers, and the families who support them. Temples may receive gold and silver, but their daily life depends on bread. Beer, animals, oil, and storage jars, and the king may command distant vassals, but if grain does not arrive, command begins to sound hollow. Power in the Bronze Age is never only a matter of weapons. It is a matter of food turned into obedience. This is easy to forget when looking at monumental ruins. Stone survives better than hunger. Walls remain visible long after granaries have emptied. Yet in a palace economy, food is not merely background, it is administration. The Hittites count, collect, redistribute, and store. Officials supervise lands, labour, animals, and deliveries. The state depends on a constant movement of agricultural wealth from villages and subject territories towards centres of power. Some of that wealth supports the royal household, some supports temples, some rewards elites, some feeds workers and soldiers, some is held against crisis. The system can look stable as long as the harvests are predictable enough and the roads remain open enough, but there is little romance in its weakness. A missed shipment is not dramatic at first. A poor harvest does not immediately topple a throne. It waits, accumulates, and turns every other problem sharper. Anatolia does not offer the Hittites the same kind of agricultural security that Egypt receives from the Nile. The plateau can be productive, but it is vulnerable to variation. Rainfall matters, snowfall matters. Local conditions differ by region and elevation. A dry year may be manageable if stores are full and neighbouring regions can help. Several dry years become something else entirely. They reduce seed grain, they weaken animals. They force communities to consume what should have been saved. They make tax demands feel predatory. They make vassals reluctant to send supplies away from their own hungry populations. In such conditions, imperial authority begins to compete with local survival. The Hittites know this problem intimately. Their records include administrative concerns that show how carefully the palace tries to manage resources. They also reveal a world in which land grants, obligations, temple holdings, and military service are intertwined. A field is not just a field. It may belong to an institution, support a cult, provide revenue to a royal servant, or carry duties attached to it. This creates a dense web of rights and expectations in prosperous times. Such a web can hold society together. In crisis, it can become rigid. Everyone has claims, everyone has obligations, everyone needs grain. One lesser-known detail is the scale of Hittite concern with cultic maintenance. Temples require regular offerings, and ritual texts often specify food, drink, animals, vessels, and precise procedures. To modernize, this may seem separate from politics, but to the Hittites it is central. If the gods are not fed, honoured, and approached properly, the land may suffer. So even during strain, the palace cannot simply cut religious obligations without risking a different kind of crisis. A hungry army threatens the state from one direction, neglected gods threaten it from another. What survives in the record suggests that rulers lived inside both pressures at once. The empire's Syrian possessions add another layer. Northern Syria is valuable because it links Anatolia to trade routes, cities, and resources beyond the plateau. But it is also far from Hattusa and politically delicate. Grain, tribute, and military support from these regions matter, especially during shortages. If the Anatolian heartland suffers, the empire may look southward for relief, yet Syria itself can experience stress. It has its own cities, rulers, fields, ports, and vulnerabilities. If drought or war affects both Anatolia and Syria, the imperial centre loses one of its escape routes. The palace can demand food, but demand does not create harvests. This is where the Hittite economy becomes part of the wider Bronze Age system described earlier. Food does not move in isolation. It moves with security, trust, ships, animals, labour, and political order. A grain shipment from one region to another requires more than surplus. It requires containers, transport, guards, roads or ports, officials, and the confidence that the shipment will not be stolen, delayed, diverted, or needed desperately at home, in a stable world. This is difficult but possible. In a destabilizing world, every link becomes uncertain. A drought may begin in the sky, but famine becomes political on the ground. The end of the Hittite Empire shows hints of this pressure. Later records from the broader region, including appeals for grain and signs of shortage, suggest that food stress was not an imaginary danger. Scholars still debate how severe and widespread the droughts were, how directly they contributed to the collapse, and how they interacted with war and migration. Climate data from tree rings, lake sediments, and other proxies has strengthened the case that environmental stress played a role in the late Bronze Age crisis. Though no single explanation fully accounts for the destruction of specific cities or the fall of particular dynasties, weather weakens systems, people decide what happens next. For ordinary people, the experience of imperial strain would not have appeared as a grand historical process. It would have appeared as smaller, harsher changes, more grain taken by officials, fewer animals surviving winter, seed saved with greater anxiety, young men pulled into service, rumours of enemy movement, roads becoming unsafe, prices shifting, temples demanding offerings because the gods must be appeased. Palace agents arriving with orders that sound increasingly detached from village reality. The collapse of an empire begins, for many, as the tightening of daily life. For elites, the same shortage becomes a threat to status. A king must give, he must reward loyalty, host envoys, supply campaigns, maintain festivals, and display abundance. If he cannot, his aura weakens. Vassals begin to calculate, officials hoard, rivals whisper. A palace that cannot feed its dependents becomes less like the centre of the world and more like another hungry claimant. Hunger strips away the mystery of power. It reveals that kings, too, depend on weather and barns. This does not mean grain alone destroys Hattusa. History is rarely so obedient. The evidence remains incomplete, and the fall of the Hittite Empire must be understood as a convergence of pressures rather than a single empty granary. But grain is the pressure that makes many other pressures more dangerous. War is harder when stores are low. Diplomacy is weaker when gifts cannot be sent. Rebellion is more tempting when tribute feels unbearable. Migration grows more likely when fields fail. Even royal succession becomes more explosive when the prize is a shrinking storehouse. So beneath the throne, beneath the ritual language of sacred kingship and the disciplined formulas of treaty tablets, there is always the quiet arithmetic of survival. How much has been harvested? How much has been stored? How much must be offered, shipped, guarded, redistributed, and hidden? The Hittite Empire can command armies and negotiate with Egypt, but it cannot command rain, and as the late Bronze Age world moves toward crisis, the most dangerous enemy may not first appear at the gate. It may appear as an empty field, a failed granary, and the slow realization that the centre can no longer promise enough. The Hittite Empire is never surrounded by emptiness. Its borders are not clean lines drawn across quiet land, but zones of argument, pressure, negotiation, and violence. Beyond the reach of Hattusa lie rival kings, restless vassals, mountain communities, ambitious neighbours, and groups whose names flicker in the records like shapes seen through smoke. The empire can look vast on a map, but on the ground it is held together by roads, garrisons, treaties, personal loyalties, and the repeated willingness of local rulers to believe that obedience is safer than rebellion. The moment that belief weakens, the edges begin to move. To the north, the Hittites face the Kaska, a people or collection of groups from the Pontic mountain regions who become one of the empire's most persistent dangers. They are not remembered through grand monuments of their own. So much of what is known comes from Hittite records written by their enemies. That makes the picture incomplete and one-sided. Still, the Kaska appear again and again as raiders, occupiers, and disruptors, capable of threatening Hittite towns and even helping create periods when Hattusa itself is vulnerable. They are a reminder that imperial power is often weakest where terrain favours people who know every valley, forest track, and mountain passage better than royal armies do. The Kaska problem is not simply a military nuisance, it drains attention. A king facing trouble in Syria cannot ignore northern raids. A ruler managing palace politics cannot allow frontier lands to slip away. Campaigns against mountain peoples may win victories, but victories in such regions are rarely final. The land itself works against permanence. Villages can scatter, fighters can withdraw, fortresses can be retaken, lost, and retaken again. What survives in the record suggests a frontier that has to be managed constantly, never solved completely. This is exhausting for an empire that already depends on constant movement of food, troops, and authority. To the west, the picture becomes even more complicated. Hittite texts mention lands and powers such as Arzawa, Ahiawa, Wilusa, and other Western Anatolian polities whose identities and relationships have been heavily debated. Ahiawa is often associated by scholars with the Mycenaean Greek world, though details remain uncertain. Wilusa is widely connected with the region later remembered as Troy. But the relationship between Hittite records and later Greek epic traditions must be handled carefully. It is tempting to turn every Western Anatolian reference into a scene from legend, but the tablets are not poems. They are political documents from a world of treaties, disputes, fugitives, and contested influence. The West matters because it shows that the Hittites are not only an Eastern imperial power competing with Egypt and Assyria, they are also entangled with Aegean-connected networks and local Anatolian kingdoms whose loyalties shift. A rebellious ruler in Western Anatolia can become a problem not because he threatens Hattusa directly in one dramatic march, but because he opens space for rival influence, disrupts routes, and forces the king to spend resources far from other crises. Empires are rarely destroyed by one enemy at one gate. They are worn down by too many problems in too many directions. In the southeast, the Hittites must watch Assyria, a power that grows increasingly dangerous. Earlier, the Hittites could treat northern Syria as a zone of prestige and wealth, contested most famously with Egypt. But Assyria's rise changes the balance. Assyrian kings push westward and northward, bringing a hard-edged military and administrative tradition into regions that matter deeply to Hittite security. The struggle over places such as Hanigalbat and the upper Mesopotamian frontier is not just border drama, it threatens access, influence, and the strategic depth that protects Hittite Syria. A strong Assyria means the Hittites cannot assume that the eastern approaches will remain manageable. This kind of multi-front pressure is especially dangerous in a system built on vassalage. Vassals are useful because they extend imperial reach without requiring the capital to govern every town directly. They provide tribute, troops, local knowledge, and buffer zones. But vassals are also political weather vanes. They feel changes in imperial strength early. If Hattusa is powerful, loyalty looks prudent. If the king is distracted, hungry, old, contested, or defeated, loyalty begins to look negotiable. A vassal does not need to love rebellion. He only needs to believe that the old fear is weakened. Hittite treaties are full of anxiety about exactly this. They warn vassals not to hide fugitives, not to correspond with enemies, not to rebel, not to alter succession, not to forget the favours of the great king. These warnings are not abstract. They identify the behaviours imperial rulers expect and fear. The treaty tablet becomes a map of mistrust. Every clause points toward a possible fracture. Every curse imagines disobedience already forming in the mind of the subordinate ruler. In this sense, the Hittite archive preserves not only law, but imperial nervousness. One lesser-known detail is the role of royal relatives installed in strategic regions. Members of the royal family could govern important territories, such as Carchemish in Syria, where a Hittite dynasty helped maintain imperial control. This could strengthen the empire by placing trusted blood near vital frontiers, but it could also create semi-independent power centres with their own resources, armies, and local interests. In stable times, such arrangements extend royal authority. In unstable times, they may help fragment survive after the centre fails. The same structure that supports empire can become the skeleton of its afterlife. Enemies at the edges do not have to coordinate to become deadly. The Kaska in the north rival Western Anatolian powers, Assyrian pressure in the east, Syrian vassal uncertainty, and possible maritime disruption in the south and west all create overlapping demands. Each problem may be manageable alone. Together, they force the empire to spend more energy just to remain itself. A campaign in one direction leaves another frontier exposed. A treaty in one region may be undermined by defeat in another. A shortage of grain or horses makes every military decision harder. No single enemy needs to be strong enough to destroy the Hittites if several are strong enough to keep them from recovering. For people living near these frontiers, empire is not an idea. It is a passing column of troops, a tax demand, a treaty oath, a raid at dawn, a local ruler changing allegiance, or the sudden arrival of refugees from a neighbouring district. Border communities often understand collapse before capitals admit it. They see roads become unsafe. They hear which fortress has stopped sending messages. They know when officials no longer return. The centre may still speak in the old language of command. But the edges feel where the command is real. This is the world closing around the Hittite Empire before the final destruction of Hattusa. Not a single storm, but weather from every direction. The empire has survived difficult reigns, rebellions, and foreign wars before, so danger itself is not new. What changes is the accumulation. Food systems are strained. Political loyalty is costly. Rivals are alert. Border enemies remain persistent. Great power competition shifts. The wider Bronze Age network becomes less stable. Scholars still debate which pressure mattered most, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the outline is clear enough. Hattusa stands at the centre of an empire whose edges are beginning to fray. And when the edges fray, the centre must pull harder. It must send more soldiers, demand more grain, write more treaties, call more gods to witness, punish more rebels, reassure more allies, and pretend more confidently that the old order still holds. That performance can continue for a long time. Ancient states are often more resilient than they appear, but resilience has a cost. By the time enemies gather at the edges, the empire may already be spending its future simply to defend its present. The first signs of a climate turning against kings do not look like catastrophe. They look ordinary, almost forgettable, until they repeat. A winter leaves less snow on the hills, a spring arrives with thinner streams, a field that usually produces enough barley gives less than expected. A flock moves farther to find pasture. A village elder remembers another dry year long ago and says the land has recovered before. The palace does not panic at once. Ancient states are accustomed to variation. They store, redistribute, command, sacrifice, and wait for the next season to correct the last. But when failed rains return, when the ground hardens again, when the harvest shrinks not once but several times within a generation, already strained by war and politics, weather stops being background. It becomes history. For the Hittite Empire, climate stress is one of the most compelling and difficult pieces of the collapse puzzle. Anatolia's high plateau depends heavily on seasonal precipitation. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile's flood can carry water from distant rainfall zones, much of central Anatolia lives closer to the sky above it. Rain and snow feed fields, animals, springs, and reservoirs. When precipitation falters, the consequences do not remain politely in the countryside. They climb the administrative ladder. Less grain means less tribute. Less tribute means weaker storage. Weaker storage means fewer reserves for armies, workers, temples, and crisis relief. A king can order scribes to record abundance, but he cannot make clouds obey cuneiform. Modern scientific evidence has made the climate question harder to dismiss, though it has not solved everything. Tree ring studies, lake sediments, pollen records, and other environmental clues suggest episodes of drought and instability around the end of the Late Bronze Age in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The details vary by region, and scholars still debate the timing, severity, and local effects of these shifts. Climate data does not point to a single day when the Bronze Age ended. It shows stress patterns, probabilities, and ecological pressure. That is important because drought alone rarely destroys a complex society. Drought tests it. The collapse depends on what the society can absorb, what it can import, who it can feed, and how much trust remains when scarcity spreads. In Hittite territory, the problem is sharpened by geography. Central Anatolia can be productive, but it is not uniformly generous. Farming communities must deal with elevation, cold seasons, dry summers, and uneven soils. A run of poor years can damage not only food supplies but also animal power. Oxen, sheep, goats, and horses all depend on pasture and fodder. A chariot empire needs horses, a farming system needs draft animals, a transport system needs pack animals when drought strikes. Drought. The loss is not limited to bread. It affects movement, warfare, ploughing, trade, and the ability to recover after the next crisis. Hunger consumes the future by forcing people to eat seed grain, slaughter breeding animals, or abandon land that normally sustains them. The Hittites respond to natural danger through both practical and ritual means. They store grain, organize supply, command deliveries, and move goods across regions when they can. But they also ask why the gods are angry. In their worldview, climate is not merely mechanical. Storms, rains, disease, and fertility belong to a sacred order. The storm god is not poetic decoration. He stands at the heart of Hittite royal ideology. A drought, therefore, can become more than an agricultural problem. It can suggest divine displeasure, ritual failure, pollution, broken oaths, or neglected obligations. This does not make Hittite responses irrational. It means they live in a world where practical and sacred causes overlap. To repair the land, one must repair the relationship between humans and gods. One surprising detail from Hittite religious life is the intense concern with forgotten or improperly performed rituals. Texts sometimes describe efforts to identify which deity has been offended, which ceremony has been neglected, or which old obligation must be restored. In a stable period, such concern reinforces order. In a crisis, it can become a sign of anxiety spreading through the royal system. If the rains fail, the king must not only find grain, he must also find meaning. The palace must act as granary, court, military headquarters, and ritual hospital for a wounded cosmos. But ritual cannot replace surplus. If drought weakens the heartland while enemies press the borders, the empire enters a dangerous spiral. Campaigns require supplies at exactly the moment supplies become harder to collect. Frontier defences need men and animals at exactly the moment villages need labour to preserve fields and herds. Vassals are asked for loyalty at exactly the moment local communities become less willing to send food away. The centre's demands may increase because the crisis is severe, but the ability of the provinces to meet those demands decreases because the crisis is severe. This is how an empire can become harsher and weaker at the same time. The climate explanation also helps make sense of the wider pattern of late Bronze Age disruption. If drought affects several regions at once, the usual solutions begin to fail. A kingdom suffering shortage might normally import grain from a neighbour, but if the neighbour also suffers, food becomes politically sensitive. If coastal trade is disrupted by war or piracy, shipments become unreliable. If displaced populations begin moving because their own lands can no longer support them. Receiving regions face new pressure. Environmental stress can become migration. Migration can become conflict. Conflict can disrupt trade, and disrupted trade can deepen famine. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but climate may have acted as the slow hand pressing on every weak point. It is important not to imagine the Hittites as passive victims of weather. They had survived bad years before. They had institutions, storage systems, administrative experience, and access to multiple regions. Ancient societies are not fragile simply because they are ancient. Many are remarkably adaptive. The danger comes when environmental stress coincides with political instability, military threats, and economic interdependence. A drought that one generation might survive can become devastating if it arrives when royal succession is contested. Vassals are restless, enemies are alert, and international trade is already unstable. For ordinary families, climate crisis would have been measured in the body: less bread, thinner animals, longer walks for water, more anxiety at planting, more fear when officials arrive, more prayers, more offerings if offerings can still be spared, more rumours that another district has been abandoned or that raiders have appeared where guards used to patrol. The collapse of royal authority may be recorded in archives, but the collapse of confidence begins in houses, fields, and storage pits. It begins when people stop believing next year will restore what this year has taken. At Hattusa, the palace may have continued to project order even as the environmental ground beneath it shifted. Festivals could still be performed, tablets could still be written, orders could still be sent, the great walls still stood. To an observer at court, the empire may not have looked doomed. Complex systems often appear functional until they suddenly do not. Their weakness is distributed, hidden in delayed shipments, exhausted villages, anxious vassals. And stores that look sufficient only if the next harvest is normal. When the next harvest is not normal, the illusion thins. The climate does not need to burn Hattusa itself, it only needs to help create the conditions in which Hattusa can no longer be defended, fed, bathed, or believed in. Fire may leave the visible scar, but drought may have written the earlier lines in dry soil and empty granaries. The tragedy is that weather leaves fewer dramatic ruins than war. A burned gate can be excavated, a failed rain cloud cannot, and so the ancient empire seems to fall in flame. While one of its quiet enemies may have been gathering for years above the fields, invisible until the harvest failed and the king's promises began to sound like echoes. The closer the Hittite Empire moves toward its end, the more valuable its surviving words become. Ruins show that something happened, but tablets reveal how people tried to think while it was happening. Clay preserves fear differently from stone. A burned wall tells us there was fire, a letter tells us someone knew the fire might be coming, or feared that ships had not arrived, or begged for help before the roads closed. The Late Bronze Age did not leave behind a continuous diary of collapse, and the evidence remains incomplete, but scattered messages from Hittite and neighbouring archives allow a rare glimpse into a world where the old system is no longer confident, yet has not fully admitted that it is dying. At Hattusa, the archive is both magnificent and frustrating. Thousands of tablets survive, covering treaties, rituals, laws, myths, instructions, prayers, inventories, and diplomatic affairs. They reveal a state obsessed with recording obligations, but archives do not preserve everything evenly. They preserve what officials chose to write, what fires accidentally baked, what excavators later found, and what time did not destroy. The last years of the Empire do not unfold in a neat sequence. There is no final tablet saying the end has arrived. Instead, there are fragments of pressure letters about grain, references to military trouble, appeals between rulers, and the broader silence that follows once the central system stops producing its normal stream of written order. Some of the most haunting evidence comes from outside Hattusa, especially from Ugarit on the Syrian coast. Ugarit was a wealthy port kingdom tied into the Hittite world, sitting where inland caravans and Mediterranean routes met. Its archives preserve a society that is literate, commercial, diplomatic, and deeply connected. Near the end, letters show a kingdom under strain. There are references to enemy ships, absent troops, and urgent danger. One famous message from the period describes ships of the enemy being seen and cities burned, though exact interpretation and context are still debated. The power of such texts lies not in giving a complete explanation, but in showing panic inside the network before it breaks. Ugarit matters to the Hittite story because it was not some remote village beyond imperial concern. It was part of the northern Syrian sphere shaped by Hittite power. If Ugarit trembled, Hittite interest trembled with it. The port linked trade, communication, and supply across sea and land. Its fall was not merely local destruction, it was a wound in the connective tissue of the Bronze Age. A message asking for help from a king or official only matters if help can still arrive. Near the end, the tragic question is whether anyone still had enough ships, soldiers, grain, or authority to answer. The letters from this world often carry an administrative calm that makes them more chilling. Ancient scribes do not write like modern disaster reporters. They report shortages, threats, obligations, and failures in the language of duty. A ruler asks why a shipment has not come. An official explains that troops are elsewhere. A king demands grain. A vassal insists on loyalty while describing danger. The surface remains formal, but beneath it is strain. The same diplomatic language once used to exchange gifts between confident courts now carries the weight of emergency. The structure of the old world remains in the grammar even as the old world weakens in reality. The Hittite kings themselves appear to have faced food problems serious enough to seek supplies beyond normal channels. Evidence from the broader eastern Mediterranean suggests grain shipments became urgent political matters. Egypt, with its agricultural strength, may have played a role in supplying grain to Hittite lands at moments of shortage. This does not mean Egypt was effortlessly abundant, or that Hittite famine alone explains collapse. But it shows the vulnerability of an empire that had once seemed self-commanding. When a great king must depend on distant grain, the language of equality between royal brothers hides a very practical fear without food. Armies and oaths dissolve. There is also the shadow of military redeployment. Some late letters from Ugarit indicate that local forces may have been absent when danger approached, possibly serving Hittite demands elsewhere. If true, this is one of the cruel patterns of imperial crisis. The centre pulls troops from the edge to solve one emergency, leaving the edge exposed to another. A coastal city sends men inland, enemy ships appear, a ruler begs for help, but the empire has too many fires and too few hands. Scholars still debate the exact sequence, and caution is necessary, but the pattern fits what complex states often experience under stress. Every solution becomes the cause of another weakness. In these records, the enemy is sometimes unclear. That uncertainty has fed centuries of speculation. Were the attackers organised invaders, pirates, displaced families, rebel coalitions, former mercenaries, hungry migrants, or some shifting combination of all these? The texts do not always say. They use names and categories that made sense to their writers, but do not always map cleanly onto modern identities. The danger of reading them too simply is that we turn a messy age of movement and desperation into a single villain. What survives in the record suggests a more unstable world, where people on the move may have included warriors, refugees, raiders, and communities searching for survival. The Hittite archive also preserves royal anxiety through treaties and instructions from earlier and later phases. The repeated insistence on loyalty, the fear of fugitives, the demand that vassals report hostile movements, and the use of divine curses all become more significant when read against collapse. These documents were not written because the Hittites believed loyalty was natural. They were written because loyalty was fragile. By the final years, fragility may have outpaced the ability of tablets to contain it. A treaty can define betrayal, but it cannot stop a starving vassal from calculating his chances if the great king no longer appears strong. One lesser known but important clue lies in what archives do after collapse. They stop, not because people lose the ability to speak, farm, worship, or remember, but because the institutions that required this kind of writing have failed. Cuneiform administration depends on trained scribes, schools, offices, storage systems, and authorities who need records. When the palace system breaks, writing can diminish even if population continues. Silence in the archive is therefore not silence in the land, it is the silence of a particular kind of power. That silence is easy to misunderstand. For centuries, the disappearance of Hittite imperial records made the empire seem more vanished than it truly was. People remained in Anatolia and Syria, local powers survived, cultural traditions continued, but the voice of Hattusa as imperial command ceased. That is why the final tablets feel like messages from the edge of a cliff. They do not narrate the fall completely. They simply carry the last normal gestures of a system that does not yet know how close the edge has come. The letters from a dying system show no single moment when everyone understands that the Bronze Age order is ending. Instead, they show people trying to solve immediate problems, send grain, return troops, watch the ships, honour the treaty, guard the city, report the enemy, appease the gods, answer the king. Each command makes sense by itself. Together, they reveal a system fighting too many emergencies at once. This is the deep tragedy of the Hittite collapse. It was not necessarily a failure of intelligence. The rulers were not blind. The scribes were not silent. The warnings existed, but warnings are only useful when a society still has enough strength to act on them. By the time the archive falls quiet, the old world has already begun to fragment into local fears. A coastal ruler sees ships, a frontier commander sees rebellion, a farmer sees failed rain, a palace official sees empty stores, a king sees disobedience. Each sees part of the same disaster, but no one holds the whole pattern clearly enough to stop it. The clay tablets survive because fire hardens them, an accident almost too symbolic to ignore. The flames that help end the imperial world also preserve its last whispers. In those hardened scraps, the Hittite Empire is still writing, still commanding, still asking for order, even as order slips beyond the reach of words. When the capital burns, it does not burn as an ordinary city. Hattusa is more than a collection of homes, temples, storerooms, and defensive walls. It is the imperial centre, the place from which the great king's authority is made visible, recorded, and performed. To damage Hattusa is to damage the idea that the Hittite world has a centre at all. The fire that marks its end does not merely consume wood and roofing. It passes through archives, official buildings, and sacred spaces, turning an imperial language of command into debris. Yet the more closely the ruins are examined, the less simple the destruction becomes. Hattusa was burned, but perhaps not exactly as a thriving capital suddenly surprised by a single invading army. The evidence suggests something more unsettling: a city already weakened, possibly partially emptied, whose final destruction may have followed a period of withdrawal, disorder, or deliberate abandonment. The ruins lie across a dramatic landscape of ridges, slopes, and stone outcrops. Hattusa was designed around the land rather than imposed neatly upon it. Walls climbed with the terrain. Gates framed movement. Sacred and administrative spaces occupied zones that gave the city an almost theatrical presence. At its height, the capital must have seemed difficult to imagine as temporary. The fortifications alone conveyed confidence. The Lion Gate, Sphinx Gate, and King's Gate were not only military structures but statements of guarded power. Anyone approaching the city entered through symbols of divine protection and royal force. In the final phase, those symbols remained. But symbols cannot defend an empire once the institutions behind them have begun to fail. Archaeology shows destruction by fire in important areas, including parts of the royal citadel and administrative zones. The burning hardened many tablets, accidentally preserving the archive that now allows the Hittite world to speak. But there are also signs that complicate the image of sudden slaughter. Some areas appear to have been cleared before destruction. Certain valuable objects seem to have been removed. The pattern does not always resemble a city caught completely unaware with all its wealth intact. Scholars still debate what this means. Perhaps the capital was evacuated in advance because danger was expected. Perhaps royal authority had already moved elsewhere. Perhaps internal conflict led to selective destruction. Perhaps attackers entered a city no longer fully occupied. The evidence remains incomplete, and Hattusa keeps part of its final night hidden. This uncertainty is one of the reasons the collapse feels so mysterious. A dramatic story would be easier. An enemy army arrives, the walls fall, the palace burns, the empire ends, but the actual remains resist such clean narration. If Hattusa was partly emptied before the fires, then the most important moment may not have been the burning itself. It may have been the decision, forced or deliberate, to leave. A capital is not abandoned lightly. To remove people, goods, tablets, brittle objects, or administrative functions from such a city would mean that the centre had already lost some of its certainty. The empire may have been trying to survive by shifting away from its own symbolic heart. The political situation near the end is difficult to reconstruct. The last known Hittite kings, including Suppiluliuma II, rule in a period of mounting stress. Records suggest military activity, naval operations, and struggles in regions such as Cyprus and southern Anatolia, but the picture is fragmentary. The very fact that the last king's reign becomes shadowy is telling. Earlier, Hittite rulers leave stronger impressions in archives and foreign relations. Near the end, the royal voice thins. That thinning may reflect the loss of records, but it may also reflect the shrinking reach of royal command. A king can still claim victory in one place while the larger structure weakens elsewhere. One lesser-known detail is that Hattusa's location, so powerful in one context, may have become a liability in another. Its inland position and highland setting made it defensible and symbolically tied to the Anatolian heartland. But it also depended on supply from surrounding regions. If drought strained the plateau, if roads became unsafe, if northern threats intensified, and if southern territories became harder to control, then the capital's grandeur could turn into isolation. A palace city requires food, fuel, workers, animals, craftsmen, priests, guards, and administrators. It is not self-sustaining simply because its walls are strong. Under severe stress, maintaining Hattusa may have become too costly for the weakened state it was meant to represent. The fire itself must have been terrible, whether it came through attack, internal violence, or destruction after evacuation. Roof timbers burned, mud brick hardened and cracked, stored materials fed heat. Smoke moved through rooms where scribes had once shaped wet clay into records of law and ritual. Tablets, which were normally dried but not always fully fired, baked in the destruction. Some were broken, scattered, or buried under collapse. The archive's survival is therefore bound to catastrophe. Without the burning, many tablets might have dissolved over time. The empire's death preserved parts of its memory better than peace would have done. History often survives through accidents that would have horrified the people who made it. What happened to the inhabitants is hard to know. If evacuation occurred, some may have left before the last destruction. Officials, priests, craftsmen, and soldiers could have moved towards safer regions or remaining centres of power. Ordinary residents may have scattered into the countryside, joined other communities, or followed political authorities elsewhere. If attackers entered, there may have been killing, capture, and flight. Archaeology can sometimes reveal bodies, weapons, and sudden destruction. But at Hattusa, the evidence does not provide a simple human scene. The silence around the people is one of the most painful gaps. We can see the burned institutions more clearly than the lives passing out of them. The destruction of a capital also creates psychological consequences beyond the city. Vassals who hear that Hattusa has fallen, burned, or been abandoned would understand that the old order has changed. Even if royal relatives or regional Hittite authorities survive elsewhere, the symbolic damage is immense. Treaties sworn before the gods of Hatti depend on the aura of the great king. If the capital no longer functions, what does loyalty mean if messengers no longer come from the palace? Who enforces old obligations if the central archive is silent? Local rulers begin to write their own futures. Collapse spreads not only through armies, but through changed expectations. Still, the burning of Hattusa should not be mistaken for the instant disappearance of everything Hittite. The imperial capital falls, but the cultural and political world does not vanish in one stroke. Some southeastern and Syrian centres connected to Hittite rule continue in transformed ways. Royal lines or local dynasties preserve elements of Hittite identity. Gods, symbols, artistic styles, and titles outlive the central empire. This is why the phrase collapsed overnight is both powerful and misleading. Overnight is how the final layer can look. The deeper process is longer, stranger, and more uneven. What makes Hattusa so haunting is the contrast between its ambition and its abandonment. Here was a city built to organise time itself, rituals for seasons, records for treaties, archives for memory, gates for power, temples for gods, and walls for defence. Yet at the end, all that organisation cannot prevent silence. The final destruction does not answer the mystery. It sharpens it. A capital may burn because enemies are strong, because rulers are weak, because food is gone, because politics is fractured, because the people have already left, or because all these things have converged until no one cause can be separated cleanly from another. So the ash at Hattusa is not a period at the end of a sentence. It is a dark comma in a larger unravelling. It marks the point where an imperial centre becomes an archaeological site, where administration becomes memory, where royal command becomes hardened clay beneath collapsed walls. The city burns, and the world that depended on it must decide whether it can continue without its heart. In some places, fragments do continue, but the empire of Hattusa, the great kingdom that once stood among Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, is no longer able to speak in the old voice. The capital has become a ruin, and beyond its walls, other forces are already moving through the broken spaces of the Bronze Age. Beyond the burnt capital and the silent tablets stands one of the most famous and misunderstood shadows of the late Bronze Age, the Sea Peoples. Their name has become almost too powerful. It suggests fleets appearing from nowhere, armies sweeping across coastlands, and mysterious invaders bringing the old world down in fire. The phrase carries drama, and drama can harden into explanation before the evidence is ready. For generations, The Sea Peoples have been treated in popular imagination as the destroyers of the Bronze Age, the human storm that crashed into Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, Syria, and Anatolia at the very moment when great kingdoms were already trembling. But the closer one looks, the less they resemble a single united enemy, and the more they appear as part of a wider age of displacement, violence, hunger, opportunity, and collapse. The main reason the Sea Peoples loom so large is Egypt. Pharaohs carved victories into stone, and stone survives with impressive confidence. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Meneptah and Ramesses III describe groups with names such as Shurden, Shekelesh, Luka, Peliset, Cheka, Denian, and Weshesh, among others. These texts present them as dangerous enemies moving by land and sea, sometimes with families, carts, and possessions, sometimes as warriors in ships. Sometimes as coalitions threatening Egypt's borders. The images from Medinet Habu, carved under Ramesses III, are especially vivid ships locked in battle, enemies with feathered or horned headgear, Egyptian archers firing from the shore, and the pharaoh shown as the defender of order against chaos. It is unforgettable propaganda. Propaganda is not the same as fiction, but it is not neutral reporting either. Egyptian royal inscriptions are designed to magnify Pharaoh's power. They arrange events into a cosmic pattern in which Egypt survives because the king crushes disorder. That means the Sea Peoples were real enough to matter, but the Egyptian presentation of them must be read with care. The inscriptions do not provide a simple map of where each group came from, why they moved, how they related to one another, or what role they played in destroying other states. They tell us that Egypt perceived major threats involving mobile groups from multiple regions. They do not prove that one organised invasion caused every collapse from Hattusa to Ugarit. For the Hittite story, this distinction is essential. It is tempting to imagine fleets of Sea Peoples sailing directly to Anatolia, burning Hattusa and ending the empire in one dramatic campaign. But Hattusa lies inland, far from the coast, protected by the rough geography of central Anatolia. Maritime raiders may have devastated ports, disrupted trade, attacked coastal allies, and destabilized Hittite-controlled regions, especially in Syria and southern Anatolia. They could have helped sever the empire's connections to the sea, yet they are unlikely to explain by themselves the abandonment or destruction of the highland capital. The evidence remains incomplete, but the geography alone warns against a simple invasion tale. Some of the groups named in Egyptian records may connect to regions already known to the Hittites. The Luka, for example, are often associated with southwestern Anatolia, and Hittite texts mention Luka lands long before the final collapse. They appear as troublesome, semi-independent, and difficult to control. Not as strangers suddenly arriving from the edge of the world. This is a revealing detail. What later Egyptian records group under the frightening image of Sea Peoples may include populations from areas already entangled with Hittite politics. In other words, the crisis may not have come only from outside the Bronze Age system. Some of it may have come from its margins, its restless borderlands, and its own displaced subjects. The Peliset are often linked to the later Philistines, who settle along the southern Levantine coast after the collapse. Archaeology in Philistine cities shows Aegean-influenced pottery and cultural traits mixed with local traditions, suggesting migration and cultural blending rather than a simple army of destroyers. This pattern may be crucial. Some groups involved in the upheavals were not only raiders, they were settlers, families, migrants, and communities seeking new homes in a destabilized world. They may have fought, burned, and plundered, but they also planted, cooked, built, and adapted. Collapse turns warriors into farmers and refugees into founders. At Ugarit, the fear of enemy ships feels immediate. Letters from the city's final days suggest that danger came from the sea, and that the city was vulnerable while troops and ships were absent or committed elsewhere. If maritime attackers destroyed Ugarit, then the Hittite world suffered a terrible blow even if those attackers never marched on Hattusa. Ugarit was a node in the network, a place where goods, intelligence, and diplomacy flowed. Its destruction would have disrupted Hittite influence in Syria and cut into the wider system that helped sustain imperial power. A port can die far from the capital and still help kill the capital's world. The Sea Peoples also matter because they represent movement in an age when movement itself becomes dangerous. When drought, famine, war, and political breakdown spread, people do not remain neatly inside old borders. Some flee, some raid, some serve as mercenaries, some join coalitions for survival, some are pushed by enemies behind them, some follow leaders who promise land elsewhere, some may have been former allies or subjects of the very kingdoms they later attacked. This mixture is hard to capture in royal inscriptions because royal inscriptions prefer enemies with names, not systems with causes. A pharaoh can defeat a named people in stone. He cannot carve a clean victory over climate stress, trade collapse, hunger, and regional fragmentation. The Hittites had long experience with mobile and semi-independent groups. The Kaska in the north, Luka in the southwest, and various frontier peoples show that imperial borders were porous zones, not walls separating civilization from chaos. When central power weakens, these groups may become more assertive, but that does not mean they cause the weakness alone. They exploit it, deepen it, and sometimes accelerate it. The same may be true of the Sea Peoples. They are not an imaginary force, but they are better understood as participants in collapse rather than the single explanation for it. No single explanation fully accounts for why so many cities were destroyed or abandoned around the same broad period. Some sites show evidence of violent destruction, Others show decline without clear burning. Some regions recover quickly in new forms. Others lose palace administration for generations. The pattern suggests not one hammer blow, but many local disasters linked by regional instability. Maritime raiders may burn one city, a drought may empty another, civil war may weaken a third. Trade failure may impoverish a fourth, refugees from one collapse may become attackers in the next. By the time Egyptian scribes describe foreign peoples moving in great numbers, the process may already be well underway. For Hattusa, the shadow armies of the age remain just that, shadows. They may have cut the empire's limbs before the heart failed, they may have helped destroy coastal partners, strained supply routes, and inspired panic among vassals. They may have included Anatolian groups who knew Hittite weaknesses well, but the burned ruins of the capital do not allow a simple verdict. Scholars still debate the balance between external attack and internal decay, between migration and raiding. Between invasion and systemic breakdown, the Sea Peoples are part of the answer, but they are not the whole answer. Their real significance may be that they reveal what happens when the old order loses the power to classify people safely. A merchant becomes a refugee, a mercenary becomes a raider, a vassal becomes an enemy, a coastal people becomes a migrating nation, a hungry family becomes part of a movement that terrified kings. The Bronze Age world had always depended on movement, but controlled movement envoys, trade, tribute, royal brides, soldiers under command. In the collapse, movement escapes control. Ships still sail, but not always with gifts. Roads still carry people, but not always with permission. The network remains, yet it now carries fear. So the Sea Peoples should not be imagined only as destroyers coming from beyond history. They are also symptoms of a world that has begun to break apart and move. Their ships appear at the edges of frightened letters and triumphant Egyptian reliefs. But behind those ships lies a wider human crisis. The Hittite Empire, already strained by hunger, enemies, succession, and failing networks, faces an age in which even the sea no longer behaves like a root of wealth. It becomes a root of uncertainty, and when uncertainty crosses water, climbs roads, and reaches the gates of cities, empires discover that the world they once connected can also become the world that overwhelms them. Inside every empire there is a second frontier, less visible than mountains or coastlines, but sometimes more dangerous. It runs through the palace itself. It passes between brothers, nephews, uncles, queens, generals, governors, sons of earlier wives, sons of later wives, and officials whose loyalty depends on which royal future seems most likely to survive. The Hittite Empire spends much of its history trying to master the violence that can grow from its own ruling house. By the time the empire approaches its end, this old weakness may have become one more crack in a structure already under pressure from drought, enemies, hunger, and broken roots. The Hittites understood the danger of succession too well. Their early history contains enough palace violence that later rulers looked back on it with alarm. The Edict of Telepinu, from centuries before the final collapse, tries to impose order on royal inheritance because previous disorders had stained the throne with blood. It describes a past in which kings and royal relatives were murdered, factions struggled, and the state suffered when the palace turned against itself. The document is not merely a legal reform, it is a confession that royal power, if not controlled, can devour its own foundations. A kingdom can win battles against foreign enemies and still be weakened by the question of who has the right to sit on the throne. This problem never entirely disappears. Hittite kingship is sacred and grand, but it is also personal. The state depends heavily on the king's authority, his family network, his ability to appoint governors, command armies, manage vassals, and perform rituals. If that authority becomes disputed, uncertainty spreads quickly. A governor may delay obedience, a vassal may wait to see who wins, a foreign king may exploit division, a military commander may become kingmaker. A royal cousin posted far from Hattusa may gain local support. The empire's administrative system is developed, but it is not a modern bureaucracy that can easily continue unchanged while leadership is contested. The king is the hinge. When the hinge bends, many doors stop closing properly. The reign of Hattusili III shows how succession conflict could shape imperial politics at the highest level. Hattusili took power from his nephew Urhi-Teshub, also known by the throne name Masili III. After a struggle that left a mark on Hittite legitimacy, Hattusili presented his actions in ways meant to justify them, invoking divine favour and political necessity. But the fact remains that the throne had been contested. He then worked hard to secure recognition, including through diplomacy with Egypt. The famous treaty with Rameses II was not only a grand international peace, it also helped confirm Hattusili as a ruler, worthy of equal treatment by another great king. In the Bronze Age, foreign recognition could strengthen a shaky throne. This is a revealing pattern. External diplomacy and internal legitimacy are intertwined. A Hittite king who is accepted abroad looks stronger at home. A king whose succession is questioned at home looks weaker abroad. Vassals in Syria, Anatolia, and border regions are watching. Enemies are watching. Royal relatives are watching. When the empire is wealthy, well-fed, and militarily successful, contested legitimacy may be survivable. When the empire is hungry and surrounded by threats, the same kind of dispute can become far more dangerous. A palace quarrel in a strong state is a crisis. A palace quarrel in a weakening state can become a fracture line. The later Hittite royal family appears to have faced tensions of its own, though the final decades are shadowy. Tudhaliya IV, Arnawanda III, and Suppiluliuma II belong to the last sequence of imperial rulers, but the records become thinner as the end approaches. There are hints of campaigns, religious activity, and attempts to maintain royal authority, yet the clear confidence of earlier imperial power fades. Scholars still debate the political dynamics of these final reigns. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be misleading to invent a detailed civil war where the records do not firmly show one. But given the long Hittite pattern of succession problems, internal rivalry remains a serious possibility in the broader collapse. One lesser-known complication is the power of royal women and palace households. Hittite queens, especially those holding the title Tawanana, could retain significant religious and political importance, sometimes even after a king's death. This could stabilise dynastic continuity, but it could also create competing centres of influence within the royal household. Marriage alliances, queenly authority, and the status of princes born to different women all shaped palace politics. In an empire where ritual legitimacy mattered deeply, the palace was not just a family residence. It was a sacred political arena. Disputes inside it could carry religious weight as well as personal ambition. There were also powerful branch lines of the royal family outside the capital. Carchemish, in northern Syria, was governed by a Hittite royal dynasty and became one of the most important centres of imperial authority beyond Anatolia. This arrangement helped the empire manage Syria, but it also meant that significant royal power existed away from Hattusa. In stable times, this was useful. In collapse, it may have allowed fragments of Hittite authority to survive independently. If the capital weakened, regional royal houses could continue ruling in their own spheres. That survival is one reason Hittite cultural and political traditions did not simply vanish when Hattusa fell. But from the viewpoint of the imperial centre, regional strength is double-edged. A powerful royal relative in Carchemish or another strategic region can defend imperial interests, but he also commands resources that may not always flow back to the capital. If communications fail, if the central king appears unable to protect the realm, or if succession becomes uncertain, regional authorities may begin acting more independently. They do not necessarily need to rebel dramatically. They may simply stop looking to Hattusa for every decision. Empire can dissolve through silence as much as through defiance. Civil war, if it occurred near the end, would have worsened every other crisis. It would divide troops, interrupt grain collection, delay responses to frontier attacks, encourage vassals to defect, and undermine the sacred image of kingship. Even rumours of palace conflict could be damaging. A vassal ruler does not need proof that the throne is weak. He needs only enough uncertainty to reconsider his obligations. Foreign enemies do not need to understand the details of Hittite genealogy. They need only see hesitation in military response. In a world held together by oaths, fear, and prestige, doubt is corrosive. Still, the fall of the Hittite Empire should not be reduced to a palace drama. No single royal quarrel explains the burning of Hattusa, the destruction of Ugarit, the weakening of Syrian networks, the pressure from Assyria, the drought evidence, or the wider Late Bronze Age upheaval. Internal conflict matters because it reduces the ability of the state to respond. It is not necessarily the first cause, it is a force multiplier. A united empire under stress might endure. A divided empire under the same stress may break. The tragedy is that the Hittite state had always known this danger. Its rulers wrote laws and edicts, swore oaths, invoked gods, arranged marriages, appointed relatives, and crafted treaties partly to control the instability of human ambition. Yet ambition does not vanish because it is cursed in a tablet. The palace remains full of memory-old grievances, disputed rights, claims through mothers, claims through fathers, claims through conquest, claims through divine favour. When the world outside grows harsher, those memories become sharper. Scarcity makes every inheritance more precious. Military danger makes every command more urgent. The throne becomes not only a symbol of power, but the last secure place in a collapsing order. So behind the burned walls of Hattusa may lie not only the footsteps of enemies, but the echo of decisions made in royal rooms where fear has already entered. Who controls the army? Who commands the stores? Who speaks for the gods? Who has the right to send orders in the king's name? Who should be obeyed if the old king dies or the new one is doubted? These are questions no empire can leave unanswered for long. The Hittites built a world of treaties to bind others to them, but near the end, the most dangerous treaty may have been the unwritten one inside the royal house, the agreement that the family would not destroy the state it claimed to rule. If that agreement failed, even briefly, then the empire met the final crisis with its hands divided against itself. When networks break, they rarely break everywhere in the same instant. A ship fails to arrive at one port, a messenger is delayed on one road, a vassal sends fewer troops than promised, a caravan waits because a pass is unsafe, a copper shipment is interrupted, a grain request becomes urgent, a border garrison hears nothing from the capital. At first, each failure looks local, practical, temporary. The palace has survived delays before. Merchants have rerouted before. Kings have punished disobedient vassals before. But a networked world depends on confidence that interruptions can be repaired. Once too many repairs fail, the system stops being a system and becomes a scattering of frightened places trying to survive alone. The Hittite Empire is deeply vulnerable to this kind of chain reaction because its power is distributed across distance. Hattusa commands from the Anatolian highlands, but its imperial life reaches towards Syria, the Euphrates, western Anatolia, mountain frontiers, ports, mines, pastures, and grain-producing districts. It depends on the steady circulation of information and supplies. Messengers must carry royal orders, scribes must record obligations, local rulers must answer. Soldiers must move before rebellions grow, grain must reach where it is needed, horses must be maintained, metal must be available, ritual obligations must continue. None of these systems works alone, each supports the others, and each can weaken the others when it fails. Bronze itself is a perfect symbol of this dependence. It is strong because it is mixed. Copper and tin brought together through roots that may stretch far beyond a single kingdom's control. A bronze sword or spearhead seems like a solid object, but it carries within it a history of mines, traders, ships, pack animals, guards, agreements, and specialists. If copper from Cyprus is disrupted, if tin routes become unreliable, if merchants avoid dangerous seas, if palaces can no longer guarantee payment or protection, bronze production suffers. Weapons can be repaired and recycled, but large military systems depend on more than recycling. They depend on predictability. A great king does not want to wonder whether next year's campaign will have enough metal. The Hittites are not alone in this. Mycenaean palaces, Syrian cities, Cypriot copper centres, Egyptian garrisons, Mesopotamian courts, and Levantine ports all participate in an international economy that rewards connection. Luxury goods move through it, but so do strategic materials: ivory, glass, textiles, silver, timber, horses, grain, copper, tin, and skilled labour travel along routes that are both commercial and political. The same sea that brings wealth can bring raiders. The same road that carries messengers can carry refugees. The same vassal who supplies troops can hide fugitives or change allegiance. Interconnection gives the Bronze Age its brilliance, but it also creates pathways for panic. One surprising feature of the Late Bronze Age is how elite its international system appears in the surviving records. Great kings exchange ceremonial gifts, address each other with elaborate formulas, and complain about status in language that can seem almost personal. Yet beneath this courtly world are thousands of ordinary acts of labour. Someone mines the copper, someone loads the ship, someone feeds the donkeys, someone repairs the wheel, someone guards the road, someone stores the grain. Palace diplomacy depends on people who will never be named in royal letters. When the system breaks, they experience it first not as diplomatic failure, but as danger, hunger, conscription, or loss of work. A broken network also damages knowledge. Ancient administrations rely on information moving fast enough to matter. If a frontier is threatened, the king must hear in time to respond. If a vassal is disloyal, evidence must reach the court. If grain is short, officials must know where surplus exists. If a port is attacked, allies must be warned. But in a crisis, information becomes slower and less trustworthy. Roads may be unsafe. Messengers may be intercepted. Local rulers may lie or delay. Rumours may travel faster than confirmed reports. The palace continues to issue commands, but its picture of the world becomes increasingly outdated. An empire can lose control before it realises control has been lost. This helps explain why collapse can appear sudden. A network may keep functioning visibly while its internal resilience is disappearing. Ships still sail, but fewer of them. Treaties still exist, but vassals trust them less. Granaries still hold food, but reserves are thinner. Armies still campaign, but at higher cost. Festivals still occur, but offerings are harder to supply. The surface of order remains because institutions are designed to preserve appearances. Then one more shock arrives. A bad harvest, an invasion, a succession crisis, a port destroyed, a major ally lost. What follows looks like overnight failure, but only because the earlier weakening was hidden in the connections. For the Hittites, Syria is one of the places where network failure becomes especially damaging. Cities like Ugarit and Carchemish link inland power to maritime routes and regional diplomacy. If coastal centres fall or become unreliable, Hattusa loses more than trade. It loses eyes, ears, warehouses, allies, and access to materials. If Carchemish continues but the capital weakens, power may remain in the region while no longer serving the old imperial structure in the same way. A limb can survive after the body has failed, but it no longer moves as part of the same organism. Assyria's pressure adds another strain to the eastern network. A stronger Assyria can threaten routes, intimidate vassals, and force the Hittites to commit resources to regions already difficult to control. Western Anatolia presents its own uncertainties, with local powers, possible Aegean involvement, and long-standing tensions. The north remains troubled by mountain groups. The south and coastal zones face maritime insecurity. The empire is not facing one broken road. It's facing the possibility that too many roads are becoming unreliable at once. No single explanation fully accounts for this unravelling, because the power of network collapse lies precisely in combination. Drought reduces grain, which weakens tribute, which limits military action, which encourages rebellion, which disrupts roads, which blocks trade, which reduces metal supply, which weakens armies further, which makes vassals doubt the king, which forces harsher demands on communities already hungry. The circle tightens. Each crisis feeds another. By the time fire reaches a city, the city may already be cut off from the world that once kept it alive. The old palace system is poorly suited to shrinking gracefully. Great kings are expected to be generous, victorious, richly competent, and internationally respected. They cannot easily announce that the empire must become smaller, poorer, and less ambitious. To do so would invite revolt, so the state keeps demanding, keeps performing abundance, keeps insisting on loyalty, perhaps even as its real capacity declines. This is not stupidity. It is a trap built into the role of kingship. A Bronze Age ruler must look strong in order to remain strong, but pretending strength consumes resources that might otherwise preserve survival. At the human level, network collapse turns distant events into local suffering. A destroyed port means a craftsman inland lacks metal. A failed harvest in one province means soldiers elsewhere go unpaid or unfed. A rebellious vassal means a village must provide more men. A blocked road means a temple does not receive offerings. A missing messenger means a town waits for orders that never come. People may not understand the whole system, but they feel its absence. The empire that once arrived as taxes, soldiers, festivals, and commands begins to arrive only as demands, rumours, and silence. This is the deeper meaning of the Hittite collapse. Hattusa did not fall only because something hit it from outside. It fell because the world that made Hattusa possible could no longer be reliably assembled around it. The capital required grain from fields, loyalty from vassals, metals from roots, gods from many traditions, soldiers from subject lands, and information from distant frontiers. When those connections failed, the walls were left defending not an empire, but a memory of one. And memories, however grand, cannot feed horses, arm soldiers, or force roads to remain open. After the centre fails, life does not simply stop. This is one of the hardest truths to hold when thinking about ancient collapse. The fall of an empire creates a dramatic line in historical memory, but people do not experience that line as neatly as historians later draw it. A shepherd still has animals if they have not been stolen or starved, a mother still looks for grain, a farmer still watches the clouds, a craftsman still knows the shape of his tools. A priest may still remember the names of gods even if the palace that once supplied offerings has burned. The Hittite Empire disappears as an imperial system, but the people who lived inside and around it do not vanish like smoke. They survive unevenly, painfully, and in new arrangements that the old tablets could not have predicted. In the ruins of a collapsed state, survival begins with scale. The great structures fail first because they require the most support. A palace needs officials, scribes, guards, storerooms, roads, tribute, and recognised authority. A village needs water, seed, animals, labour, and security. That does not make village life easy. In some places it may become desperate. But smaller communities can sometimes adapt where imperial institutions cannot. They can reduce expectations, shift fields, move herds, join stronger neighbours, abandon exposed settlements, or attach themselves to new local powers. The collapse of Hattusa is a catastrophe for the imperial elite. For ordinary people, it is also danger, but it may be experienced less as a single ending than as a long period of uncertainty in which old obligations fade and new threats arrive. Refugees must have been part of this world, though they are difficult to see directly. Archaeology rarely labels a cooking pot as belonging to a displaced family. A burned city does not tell us which survivors fled north, south, east, or west. But the wider Late Bronze Age collapse produced movements of people across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, and it would be strange if the Hittite world were exempt. Some people may have fled from Hattusa before or after its destruction. Others may have left drought-stricken villages. Still others may have moved because frontier raids, rebellion, or the collapse of local protection made their homes unsafe. They carried portable things tools, ornaments, memories, religious habits, perhaps tablets only if someone had reason and means to carry them, but more often skills and stories that left no direct written trace. The end of palace administration would have changed daily life in ways both frightening and liberating. Taxes or tribute demanded by the great king may have ceased in some regions, but so did the protection and redistribution that the imperial system could provide. Local rulers who had once answered to Hattusa might now claim fuller authority. Fortified towns could become centres of new power. Temples might continue rituals with reduced resources or under different patrons. Scribes trained in old methods might find service in surviving courts, while other scribal traditions faded where institutions no longer supported them. The disappearance of imperial writing does not mean the disappearance of intelligence. It means the disappearance of the offices that required certain kinds of records. Carchemish is crucial here. While Hattusa falls silent, Carchemish in northern Syria continues as a powerful centre connected to Hittite royal tradition. Its rulers preserve elements of Hittite identity and authority after the collapse of the central Anatolian Empire. This survival complicates any simple story of destruction. The imperial capital dies, but one of its great regional branches lives on. In some ways, Carchemish becomes a bridge between the Bronze Age Hittite Empire and the later Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian kingdoms. The old tree is cut at the trunk, but some branches root themselves in other soil. This is not merely a political technicality. It changes how the Hittite legacy survives. If every royal centre had vanished at once, the memory of Hittite power might have faded more completely. Instead, regional states continue to use related symbols, languages, artistic forms, and titles in transformed contexts. Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions become especially important in the post-imperial landscape. These inscriptions, carved on stone monuments, preserve royal claims and religious imagery in a world where cuneiform palace archives are no longer the dominant voice. One surprising detail is that later people sometimes remembered or presented themselves through traditions that modern scholars connect to the Hittite imperial world. Even though the political structure of Hattusa was gone, identity outlived administration. For survivors, the collapse may have rearranged loyalties. A person who once belonged to the Hittite Empire might now belong to a local kingdom, a city-state, a tribal community, an Assyrian sphere of influence, or no stable authority at all. Borders that once seemed fixed by treaty became negotiable. Roads that once carried official messengers now carried traders, raiders, refugees, and envoys of new powers. The gods, too, travelled through this altered world. Some deities once honoured under Hittite imperial order continued in local cults. Storm gods remained powerful in northern Syria and Anatolia. Divine names changed, merged, or endured. Religion proved more resilient than the state that had organised it. The material world also changed. With the breakdown of long-distance bronze supply networks, communities increasingly adapted to new economic realities. Ironworking gradually became more important across the region, not because iron instantly replaced bronze in one revolutionary moment, but because the old bronze system depended on tin and copper routes that had become harder to sustain. Iron ore was more widely available in many areas, though producing good iron required skill and time. The shift toward iron belongs to a broader transformation after the collapse, and scholars still debate the pace and local variation of this change. But for people living through the aftermath, the important point was practical. The old elite world of bronze, palace workshops, and international exchange no longer guaranteed the tools and weapons people needed. The landscape of power became smaller and more fragmented. In Anatolia, the old imperial unity did not return. In Syria and southeastern Anatolia, new kingdoms arose, some carrying Hittite inheritance, others shaped by Aramaean, Assyrian, Hurrian, Luwian, and local traditions. The result was not emptiness but a mosaic. To later Assyrian kings expanding westward, these kingdoms would be targets, rivals, tributaries, and sources of wealth. The world after Hattusa was not peaceful. But it was not dead. It was a different political ecology, one in which smaller states grew among the ruins of a vanished great power. This transformation must have been emotionally complex for those who remembered the empire. Older people may have recalled a time when messengers came from the great king, when festivals were supplied by imperial stores, when vassal rulers feared Hattusa, when the name of the Hittite king carried weight across borders. Younger generations may have known only fragments of a ruined road, an abandoned administrative building, a local ruler claiming old titles. A story that the capital had once been immense. Collapse becomes memory quickly when institutions do not preserve it. Within a few generations, what had been political reality could become ancestral rumour. And yet, survival has its own quiet power. The people who lived beyond the fall carried forward skills the empire had used but did not own. Farmers still knew soils, metalworkers still understood fire, builders still shaped stone, singers, priests, and families still remembered sacred names. Local elites still understood how to display authority. The Hittite imperial system had gathered these things into one great structure, but it had not created all of them from nothing. When the structure broke, the human abilities within it scattered and recombined. This is why the aftermath of Hattusa's fall should not be imagined only in darkness. There was suffering, almost certainly. There was fear, hunger, violence, displacement, and loss. But there was also adaptation. Some communities contracted and endured. Some moved and became part of new societies. Some local powers rose because the old centre could no longer restrain them. Some traditions that might have seemed secondary under imperial rule became central in the post-imperial age. The collapse destroyed a world, but it also released pieces of that world into new forms. The survivors in the ruins remind us that empires are not the same as civilizations, and states are not the same as people. Hattusa could burn while Anatolian life continued. The great king could vanish while local rulers claimed authority. The imperial archive could fall silent while memory passed through monuments, cults, and households. The Hittite Empire collapsed, but the human landscape remained restless and alive. In that restless survival lies one of the deepest lessons of the ancient catastrophe history often remembers the fall of palaces, but the future is built by those who walk away from them carrying whatever can still be used. The empire of Hattusa dies, but its ghosts do not remain quietly in the ruins. They move south and southeast, into the lands where Hittite authority had once been carried by royal relatives, vassal courts, scribes, soldiers, and sacred images. In the centuries after the fall of the imperial capital, a chain of smaller kingdoms appears across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. Modern scholars often call them Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian states. Though the names themselves are imperfect labels for a complicated world, these kingdoms are not the Hittite Empire reborn. They are fragments, heirs, imitators, survivors, and innovators, each carrying pieces of the old order into a new age that no longer belongs to the great kings of Hattusa. This is where the idea of disappearance becomes misleading. If one looks only at the capital, the Hittites vanish in ash. If one follows the symbols, languages, gods, and political habits that continue afterward, the story becomes more subtle. In places such as Carchemish, Melid, Kumu, Gurgum, Tabal, and other regional centres, rulers continue to carve monuments, invoke storm gods, display royal authority, and use artistic forms that descend in part from the old Hittite world. Some inscriptions are written in hieroglyphic Luwian, a script and language tradition deeply associated with Anatolia and northern Syria. These carved signs preserve a voice different from the cuneiform tablets of Hattusa. but not disconnected from the same broad cultural inheritance. Carchemish stands at the heart of this afterlife. It had already been important under the empire, governed by a branch of the Hittite royal family and positioned near the Euphrates, where roots, armies, and political ambitions crossed. After Hattusa falls silent, Carchemish does not immediately vanish. Instead, it becomes one of the strongest carriers of post-imperial Hittite tradition. Its rulers can claim legitimacy from the past, while adapting to a world filled with new pressures. This is a remarkable historical turn. Capital that gave the empire its identity is gone, but a regional centre once subordinate to that capital helps preserve its memory. The edge outlives the centre. The monuments of these kingdoms tell us how power wished to be seen. Kings are shown standing before gods, holding weapons, making offerings, or presenting themselves in stylized poses of authority. Lions, sphinxes, storm gods, winged beings, and sacred symbols appear in stone. The art is not frozen imitation. It blends Hittite, Syrian, Aramaean, Assyrian, and local elements. This mixture reflects the political landscape after the collapsed smaller kingdoms competing, borrowing, displaying, and negotiating identity between older traditions and rising new powers. What survives in the record suggests not a clean cultural break, but a crowded workshop of memory. One lesser known but fascinating feature of this post-imperial world is the persistence of the storm god as a central figure. In the Hittite imperial period, the storm god stands near the core of royal ideology, linked to weather, kingship, fertility, and divine authority. After the empire falls, storm gods continue to dominate monuments across northern Syria and Anatolia. This is not surprising in a land where rain, harvest, and power remain inseparable. The same divine force that once stood behind the great king of Hattusa now stands behind smaller rulers trying to make their own authority feel ancient, legitimate, and protected. The god survives the empire that served him. These ghost kingdoms also reveal how writing changes after collapse. At Hattusa, the imperial archive had depended heavily on cuneiform tablets and a scribal system connected to palace administration. In the Neo-Hittite world, monumental inscriptions in hieroglyphic Luwian become more visible. Stone replaces clay as the voice most likely to survive. The message changes as well. Instead of long archives of ritual, law, and diplomacy, many surviving inscriptions emphasize royal achievement, building projects, genealogy, divine favour, and territorial claims. The world of the tablet has not vanished everywhere, but the surviving voice of power becomes more public, more monumental, and often more local. Local is the key word. The old empire had tried to bind many regions into one hierarchy under the great king. The post-imperial kingdoms operate on a smaller scale. Their rulers face immediate neighbours, shifting alliances, and the growing shadow of Assyria. Assyria becomes the great expanding power of the early 1st millennium BC, pressing westward with a military and administrative intensity that eventually overwhelms many of these states, to Assyrian kings. The lands once touched by Hittite power become part of a frontier of tribute, conquest, rebellion, and imperial absorption. The ghost kingdoms inherit Hittite traditions, but they do not inherit Hittite security. The Assyrian records sometimes use terms that preserve memory of Hatti in broad and altered ways. To later Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, the name of the Hittites could refer not only to the old empire of Hattusa, but to peoples and states of Syria and Anatolia shaped by its aftermath. This creates confusion for modern readers, but it also shows how historical names can outlive the political realities that created them. Hatti becomes a memory, a region, a cultural label, sometimes a convenient foreign category. The empire is gone, but its name continues to drift through the language of others. These later kingdoms were not merely nostalgic remnants. They had their own histories, ambitions, rivalries, and achievements. Some controlled rich agricultural zones, some commanded strategic crossings. Some built impressive city gates, palaces, and temples. Some negotiated with or resisted Syria. Some adopted Aramaic alongside local traditions as Aramaean groups became increasingly important across Syria. The result is a multilingual, multicultural world. Not simply a Hittite museum under open sky, the legacy of Hattusa becomes one strand in a new fabric. And yet the echoes are unmistakable. The visual language of kingship, the use of hieroglyphic inscriptions, the divine prominence of storm gods, the memory of royal descent, and the geography of former Hittite influence all preserve traces of the empire. In some monuments, a viewer can feel the old imperial grammar reduced to local speech. The scale has changed, but the gestures remain. A king still stands before a god. A ruler still names his ancestors. A monument still insists that order has been made in a dangerous world. Stone still tries to defeat forgetting. This survival forces a different understanding of collapse. The Hittite Empire did not end like a lamp simply extinguished. It ended more like a great fire breaking apart into smaller flames. Some went out quickly, others burned for centuries in different places, fed by different political fuel. The central state was gone, but its cultural heat remained. Hattusa became a ruin, while Carchemish and other centres continued to speak in altered Hittite accents. The imperial body died, but its memory entered new bodies. Scholars still debate how directly these Neo-Hittite kingdoms should be connected to the old empire in every case. The evidence varies from site to site, and the term Neo-Hittite can sometimes blur local diversity. Some states were more Luwian in language and culture, some more Syrian, some increasingly Aramaean, and many were mixed. But that mixture is itself part of the legacy. The Hittite Empire had always been a collector of peoples, gods, and traditions, after its fall. The collected world did not separate neatly back into original pieces, it recombined. For a traveller moving through this post-imperial landscape centuries later, the old capital in the north might have seemed distant or forgotten, but its inheritance would still appear in carved stones, divine names, royal poses, and political claims. The ghosts of Anatolia stood at city gates. They watched from basalt reliefs. They rode in the thunderclouds of storm gods. They appeared in inscriptions that named kings no longer subject to Hattusa, yet still shaped by the world Hattusa had made. The ghost kingdoms of Anatolia and Syria therefore turned the Hittite collapse into something more haunting than simple destruction. They show that the past can survive after losing its centre. It can survive without its archives, without its capital, without its great king, even without the political form that once gave it shape. It survives by changing. That is why the ruins of Hattusa are not the final resting place of the Hittites. They are only the most dramatic silence. Beyond that silence, in smaller kingdoms under harsher skies, the old empire continues to flicker, no longer commanding the Bronze Age world, but refusing to disappear from it entirely. The phrase collapsed overnight survives because it captures how history often looks from a distance. One moment there is an empire, a capital, a great king, an archive, a diplomatic system, a place among the powers of the world. Then the record narrows. The capital burns or empties. The royal voice disappears. The old treaty system no longer speaks from Hattusa. Later generations find ruins where officials once issued commands, from far away. The Hittite Empire seems to vanish almost in a single breath. But the deeper story is less like a lightning strike and more like a long internal darkening, hidden for years beneath the public brightness of kingship. This is the myth of overnight collapse, not that sudden disasters never happen, but that sudden endings are rarely born suddenly. Hattusa's final destruction may have been dramatic, perhaps even swift. A fire can consume a building in hours, a gate can be breached in a day, a royal court can flee before dawn, yet the conditions that make such a moment decisive gather slowly. A strong empire can rebuild after a burned district. It can punish raiders, restock granaries, replace officials, silence rebels, and restore confidence. A weakened empire cannot. The same event that would once have been a crisis becomes an ending because too many supports have already failed. The Hittite case is powerful precisely because no single explanation fully accounts for it. If one begins with drought, the evidence is compelling but incomplete. Climate stress could reduce harvests, weaken herds, strain storage, and make every political obligation harder to meet. But drought alone does not explain every burned city or every broken alliance. If one begins with invasion, the Sea Peoples and other mobile groups clearly matter. But they do not explain the inland complexity of Hattusa, the long-standing problems on Hittite frontiers, or the internal fragility of the royal system. If one begins with civil conflict, the Hittites certainly had a history of dangerous succession politics, but palace rivalry alone cannot account for the simultaneous instability across the eastern Mediterranean. The truth seems to lie in convergence. Convergence is less satisfying than a single villain, but it is usually closer to how complex societies fail. The Hittite Empire had to manage a harsh Anatolian heartland, northern raiders, western uncertainty, Assyrian pressure, Syrian vassals, coastal networks, long-distance metal supplies, grain logistics, palace rituals, dynastic tensions, and the expectations of great kingship. Each challenge had been survivable at different times. The empire had endured rebellions before. It had faced enemies before. It had known political disputes before. It had surely survived bad harvests before. What changed near the end was not the existence of danger, but the stacking of danger until recovery became impossible. A useful image is not a wall struck once, but a rope fraying strand by strand. No single strand looks like the rope. No single broken fibre explains the fall. But when enough strands break, the rope fails suddenly under weight it once carried easily. The Hittite Empire was such a rope, woven from roads, oaths, kinship, harvests, gods, metals, soldiers, scribes, and fear. For generations, it held. Then the late Bronze Age crisis added weight from every direction. The rope did not need to be cut cleanly, it only needed to be frayed past endurance. The appearance of suddenness is also created by the nature of evidence. Archives end sharply because institutions end sharply. A palace bureaucracy either produces tablets or it does not. When the office fails, the written record stops, even though life continues outside it. Archaeology also favours dramatic layers ash, collapsed walls, abandoned rooms, broken pottery, burned beams. These are visible endings, slow hunger, weakened loyalty, anxious rumours, and political doubt leave fewer traces. A drought may appear in tree rings, a famine may appear indirectly in letters, but the human feeling of exhaustion, the moment when a village stops believing in the king's protection, or a vassal stops fearing Hattusa, rarely leaves a clean mark in the ground. That is why Hattusa is so haunting. The ruin gives us a final image, but the final image is not the full explanation. The city's walls and gates suggest permanence, yet permanence was always a performance requiring food, labour, ceremony, and belief. The tablets suggest order, Yet order depended on people obeying the signs pressed into clay. The treaties suggest loyalty, yet loyalty needed the king's power to remain believable. The temples suggest divine protection, yet the gods had to be fed and honoured through a functioning economy. Every symbol of Hittite strength was also a reminder of what had to be maintained. The collapse also challenges the comforting idea that only weak or primitive societies fall. The Hittites were not simple, disorganised, or historically insignificant. They were skilled administrators, diplomats, warriors, builders, and ritual specialists. They could negotiate with Egypt as equals. They could control difficult terrain. They could absorb foreign traditions and turn them into imperial culture. Their failure was not the failure of a people who did not know how to build a state. It was the failure of a sophisticated system under pressures that sophistication could not fully solve. Sometimes complexity is strength. Sometimes it becomes the number of ways a society can be wounded. Yet the ending is not absolute. The imperial state disappears, but its inheritance continues in Neo-Hittite kingdoms, in storm gods carved on stone, in hieroglyphic inscriptions, in artistic forms, in political memories, and in the altered identities of later Anatolia and Syria. The fall of Hattusa is therefore both an ending and a transformation. The old centre cannot hold, but the pieces do not dissolve into nothing. They scatter, adapt, and reappear in smaller, more local worlds. This is another reason our overnight collapse is misleading. The empire ends suddenly as a political system, but its afterlife lasts for centuries. What remains, finally, is a story about the fragility of centres. Hattusa once gathered roads, gods, words, grain, metal, and obedience into one imperial vision. It stood on a high plateau and seemed to command a world larger than its own harsh landscape. But the empire depended on movement, and movement can fail. It depended on trust, and trust can thin. It depended on rain, and rain can vanish. It depended on kingship, and kingship can divide against itself. It depended on networks, and networks can carry collapse as easily as wealth. So the ancient empire did not simply collapse overnight. It became vulnerable over time, then ended in ways that looked sudden because the last supports gave way together. The burning of Hattusa was not the whole story. It was the visible flare at the end of a long chain of strain. In the ash, we see the drama. In the droughts, treaties, letters, frontiers, and surviving ghost kingdoms. We see the deeper truth civilizations do not always fall when they are struck hardest. Sometimes they fall when they can no longer recover from being struck again. The wind moves across the plateau now without asking permission from kings. It passes through the old gates of Hattusa, over stones that once carried the weight of guards, priests, scribes, envoys, and royal messengers. It touches the places where tablets lay buried, where offerings were made, where officials counted what the empire believed it could command. The walls remain, but they no longer defend anything except memory. The city that once gathered a world into its archives has become part of the landscape again, returned to weather, grass, silence, and the slow patience of ruins. There is something humbling in that return. The Hittites built with seriousness. They did not imagine themselves as a mystery for later centuries. They planned festivals, negotiated treaties, raised gates, fought wars, stored grain, honoured gods, and tried to hold together a difficult world with all the tools their age gave them. Their empire was not a shadow while it lived. It was solid, feared, respected, and deeply organised. Yet even solid things depend on conditions they cannot fully control. Rainfall, loyalty, harvests, trade routes, dynastic peace, safe roads, obedient vassals, and the confidence of ordinary people all had to continue, season after season, for the empire to remain what it claimed to be. When those conditions failed, the end looked abrupt. Fire gave the story a final image. But the ash at Hattusa is not only a sign of destruction, it is also a reminder that history often preserves the loudest moment while hiding the quieter ones that made it possible. Before the flames, there were dry fields. Before the silence, there were unanswered letters. Before the abandonment, there were calculations made by rulers, farmers, soldiers, and local chiefs who sensed that the old promises no longer carried the same force. A civilization can begin to disappear long before its capital falls. And still, disappearance is never complete. The Hittite Empire ended, but not every song, skill, god, symbol, or memory ended with it. Its fragments crossed into smaller kingdoms and later traditions. Its tablets waited in the earth until modern hands brought them back into speech. Its ruins remind us that collapse is not only a story of failure, but also a story of survival in altered form. So the ancient empire remains there, on the high Anatolian ground, neither fully lost nor fully recovered. Its stones hold no simple answer. They offer something quieter, a warning, a question, and a final image of power becoming dust beneath an open sky.